Chapter 24 of Sir Nigel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Clive Catterall. Sir Nigel by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Chapter 24. How Nigel was called to his master. "My sweet lady," wrote Nigel, in a script which it would take the eyes of love to read, "there hath been a most noble meeting in the fourth sennight of Lent betwixt some of our own people and sundry most worthy persons of this country, which ended, by the grace of Our Lady, in so fine a joust that no man living can call to mind so fair an occasion. Much honor was gained by the Seigneur Beaumanoir, and also by an Almain named Croquart, with whom I hope to have some speech when I am hale again, for he is a most excellent person, and very ready to advance himself or to relieve another from a vow. For myself, I had hoped, with God's help, to venture that third small deed which might set me free to haste to your sweet side. But things have gone awry with me, and I early met with such a scathe, and was of so small comfort to my friends, that my heart is heavy within me, and in sooth I feel that I have lost honor rather than gained it. Here I have lain since the feast of the Virgin, and here I am like to still be, for I can move no limb save only my hand. But grieve not, sweet lady, for St. Catherine hath been our friend, since in so short a time I had two such ventures as the Red Ferret and the intaking of the Reaver's fortalice. It needs but one more deed, and sickerly, when I am hale once more, it will not be long ere I seek it out. Till then, if my eyes may not rest upon you, my heart at least is ever at thy feet." So he wrote from his sick room in the castle of Ploermel late in the summer. But yet another summer had come before his crushed head had mended and his wasted limbs had gained their strength once more. With despair he heard of the breaking of the truce, and of the fight at Mauron, in which Sir Robert Knolles and Sir Walter Bentley crushed the rising power of Brittany, a fight in which many of the 30 champions of Josselin met their end. Then, when with renewed strength and high hopes in his heart he went forth to search for the famous Croquart, who proclaimed himself ever ready night or day to meet any man with any weapon, it was only to find that in trying the paces of his new horse the German had been cast into a ditch and had broken his neck. In the same ditch perished Nigel's last chance of soon accomplishing that deed which would free him from his vow. There was truce once more over all Christendom, and mankind was sated with war, so that only in far-off Prussia, where the Teutonic knights waged ceaseless battle with the Lithuanian heathen, could he hope to find his heart's desire. But money and high knightly fame were needed ere a man could go upon the northern crusade, and 10 years were yet to pass ere Nigel should look from the battlements of Marienburg on the waters of the Frische Haff, or should endure the torture of the hot plate when bound to the holy Wodenstone of Memel. Meanwhile he chafed his burning soul out through the long seasons of garrison life in Brittany, broken only by one visit to the chateau of the father of Raoul, when he carried to the Lord of Grosbois the news of how his son had fallen like a gallant gentleman under the gateway of La Brohinière. And then at last, when all hope was well nigh dead in his heart, there came one glorious July morning which brought a horseman bearing a letter to the castle of Vannes, of which Nigel was now seneschal. It contained but few words, short and clear as the call of a war trumpet. It was Chandos who wrote. He needed his squire at his side, for his pennon was in the breeze once more. He was at Bordeaux. The prince was starting at once for Bergerac, whence he would make a great raid into France. It would not end without a battle. They had sent word of their coming, and the good French king had promised to be at great pains to receive them. Let Nigel hasten at once. If the army had left, then let him follow after with all speed. Chandos had 3 other squires, but would very gladly see his fourth once again, for he had heard much of him since he parted, and nothing which he might not have expected to hear of his father's son. Such was the letter which made the summer sun shine brighter and the blue sky seem of a still fairer blue upon that happy morning in Vannes. It is a weary way from Vannes to Bordeaux. Coastwise ships are hard to find, and winds blow north when all brave hearts would fain be speeding south. A full month had passed from the day when Nigel received his letter before he stood upon the quayside of the Garonne amid the stacked barrels of Gascon wine, and helped to lead Pommers down the gangplanks. Not Aylward himself had a worse opinion of the sea than the great yellow horse, and he whinnied with joy as he thrust his muzzle into his master's outstretched hand and stamped his ringing hoofs upon the good firm cobblestones. Beside him, slapping his tawny shoulder in encouragement, was the lean spare form of Black Simon, who had remained ever under Nigel's pennon. But Aylward, where was he? Alas! 2 years before, he and the whole of Noll's company of archers had been drafted away on the king's service to Guienne, and, since he could not write, the squire knew not whether he was alive or dead. Simon, indeed, had thrice heard of him from wandering archers, each time that he was alive and well, and newly married. But as the wife in one case was a fair maid, and in another a dark, while in the third she was a French widow, it was hard to know the truth. Already the army had been gone a month, but news of it came daily to the town, and such news as all men could read, for through the landward gates there rolled one constant stream of wagons, pouring down the Libourne road and bearing the booty of southern France. The town was full of foot soldiers, for none but mounted men had been taken by the prince. With sad faces and longing eyes they watched the passing of the train of plunder-laden carts, piled high with rich furniture, silks, velvets, tapestries, carvings, and precious metals, which had been the pride of many a lordly home in fair Auvergne or the wealthy Bourbonnais. Let no man think that in these wars England alone was face to face with France alone. There is glory and to spare without trifling with the truth. 2 provinces in France, both rich and warlike, had become English through a royal marriage, and these, Guienne and Gascony, furnished many of the most valiant soldiers under the island flag. So poor a country as England could not afford to keep a great force overseas, and so must needs have lost the war with France through want of power to uphold the struggle. The feudal system enabled an army to be drawn rapidly together with small expense, but at the end of a few weeks it dispersed again as swiftly, and only by a well-filled money chest could it be held together. There was no such chest in England, and the king was forever at his wits' end how to keep his men in the field. But Guienne and Gascony were full of knights and squires who were always ready to assemble from their isolated castles for a raid into France, and these, with the addition of those English cavaliers who fought for honor, and a few thousand of the formidable archers hired for 4 a day, made an army with which a short campaign could be carried on. Such were the materials of the prince's force, some 8,000 strong, who were now riding in a great circle through southern France, leaving a broad wail of blackened and ruined country behind them. But France, even with her southwestern corner in English hands, was still a very warlike power, far richer and more populous than her rival. Single provinces were so great that they were stronger than many a kingdom. Normandy in the north, Burgundy in the east, Brittany in the west, and Languedoc in the south were each capable of fitting out a great army of their own. Therefore the brave and spirited John, watching from Paris this insolent raid into his dominions, sent messengers in hot haste to all these great feudatories, as well as to Lorraine, Picardy, Auvergne, Hainaut, Vermandois, Champagne, and to the German mercenaries over his eastern border, bidding all of them to ride hard with bloody spur day and night until they should gather to a head at Chartres. There a great army had assembled early in September, whilst the prince, all unconscious of its presence, sacked towns and besieged castles from Bourges to Issoudun, passing Romorantin and so onward to Vierzon and to Tours. From week to week there were merry skirmishes at barriers, brisk assaults of fortresses in which much honor was won, nightly meetings with detached parties of Frenchmen, and occasional spear runnings, where noble champions deigned to venture their persons. Houses, too, were to be plundered, while wine and women were in plenty. Never had either knights or archers had so pleasant and profitable an excursion, so that it was with high heart and much hope of pleasant days at Bordeaux, with their pockets full of money, that the army turned south from the Loire and began to retrace its steps to the seaboard city. But now its pleasant and martial promenade changed suddenly to very serious work of war. As the prince moved south, he found that all supplies had been cleared away from in front of him, and that there was neither fodder for the horses nor food for the men. 200 wagons laden with spoil rolled at the head of the army, but the starving soldiers would soon have gladly changed it all for as many loads of bread and of meat. The light troops of the French had preceded them and burned or destroyed everything that could be of use. Now also, for the first time, the prince and his men became aware that a great army was moving upon the eastern side of them, streaming southward in the hope of cutting off their retreat to the sea. The sky glowed with their fires at night, and the autumn sun twinkled and gleamed from one end of the horizon to the other upon the steel caps and flashing weapons of a mighty host. Anxious to secure his plunder, and conscious that the levies of France were far superior in number to his own force, the prince redoubled his attempts to escape. But his horses were exhausted, and his starving men were hardly to be kept in order. A few more days would unfit them for battle. Therefore, when he found near the village of Maupertuis a position in which a small force might have a chance to hold its own, he gave up the attempt to outmarch his pursuers, and he turned at bay like a hunted boar, all tusks and eyes of flame. Whilst these high events had been in progress, Nigel, with Black Simon and 4 other men-at-arms from Bordeaux, was hastening northward to join the army. As far as Bergerac they were in a friendly land, but thence onward they rode over a blackened landscape, with many a roofless house, its 2 bare gable ends sticking upward. A Knolles mitre, as it was afterward called, when Sir Robert worked his stern will upon the country. For 3 days they rode northward, seeing many small parties of French in all directions, but too eager to reach the army to ease their march in search of adventures. Then, at last, after passing Lusignan, they began to come in touch with the English foragers, mounted bowmen for the most part, who were endeavoring to collect supplies either for the army or for themselves. From them Nigel learned that the prince, with Chandos ever at his side, was hastening south and might be met within a short day's march. As he still advanced, these English stragglers became more and more numerous, until at last he overtook a considerable column of archers moving in the same direction as his own party. These were men whose horses had failed them, and who had therefore been left behind on the advance, but were now hastening to be in time for the impending battle. A crowd of peasant girls accompanied them upon their march, and a whole train of laden mules were led beside them. Nigel and his little troop of men-at-arms were riding past the archers when Black Simon, with a sudden exclamation, touched his leader upon the arm. "See yonder, fair sir," he cried with gleaming eyes. "There, where the wastrel walks with a great fardel upon his back. Who is he who marches behind him?" Nigel looked and was aware of a stunted peasant who bore upon his rounded back an enormous bundle very much larger than himself. Behind him walked a burly, broad-shouldered archer, whose stained jerkin and battered headpiece gave token of long and hard service. His bow was slung over his shoulder, and his arms were round the waists of 2 buxom Frenchwomen, who tripped along beside him with much laughter and many saucy answers flung back over their shoulders to a score of admirers behind them. "Aylward!" cried Nigel, spurring forward. The archer turned his bronzed face, stared for an instant with wild eyes, and then, dropping his 2 ladies, who were instantly carried off by his comrades, he rushed to seize the hand which his young master held down to him. "Now, by my hilt, Squire Nigel, this is the fairest sight of my lifetime," he cried. "And you, old Leatherface! Nay, Simon, I would put my arms round your dried herring of a body if I could but reach you. Here is Pommers, too, and I read in his eye that he knows me well, and is as ready to put his teeth into me as when he stood in my father's stall." It was like a whiff of the heather-perfumed breezes of Hankley to see his homely face once more. Nigel laughed with sheer joy as he looked at him. "It was an ill day when the King's service called you from my side, said he. "And by St. Paul, I am right glad to set eyes upon you once more. I see well that you are in no wise altered, but the same Aylward that I have ever known. But who is this varlet with the great bundle who waits upon your movements?"
"It is no less than a feather bed, fair sir, which he bears upon his back, for I would fain bring it to Tilford, and yet it is over large for me when I take my place with my fellows in the ranks. But indeed this war has been a most excellent one, and I have already sent half a wagon load of my gear back to Bordeaux to await my homecoming. Yet I have my fears when I think of all the rascal foot soldiers who are waiting there. For some folk have no grace or honesty in their souls, and cannot keep their hands from that which belongs to another. But if I may throw my leg over yonder spare horse, I will come on with you, fair sir, for indeed it would be a joy to my heart to know that I was riding under your banner once again."
So Aylward, having given instructions to the bearer of his feather-bed, rode away in spite of shrill protests from his French companions, who speedily consoled themselves with those of his comrades who seemed to have most to give. Nigel's party was soon clear of the column of archers and riding hard in the direction of the Prince's army. They passed by a narrow and winding track through the great wood of Nouaille and found before them a marshy valley down which ran a sluggish stream. Along its farther bank hundreds of horses were being watered, and beyond was a dense block of wagons. Through these the comrades passed, and then topped a small mound from which the whole strange scene lay spread before them. Down the valley the slow stream meandered with marshy meadows on either side. A mile or two lower a huge drove of horses were to be seen assembled upon the bank. They were the steeds of the French cavalry, and the blue haze of 100 fires showed where King John's men were camping. In front of the mound upon which they stood the English line was drawn. But there were few fires, for indeed, save their horses, there was little for them to cook. Their right rested upon the river, and their array stretched across a mile of ground until the left was in touch with a tangled forest which guarded it from flank attack. In front was a long thick hedge and much broken ground, with a single deeply rutted country road cutting through it in the middle. Under the hedge and along the whole front of the position lay swarms of archers upon the grass, the greater number slumbering peacefully with sprawling limbs in the warm rays of the September sun. Behind were the quarters of the various knights, and from end to end flew the banners and pennons marked with the devices of the chivalry of England and Guienne. With a glow in his heart Nigel saw those badges of famous captains and leaders, and knew that now at last he also might show his coat armor in such noble company. There was the flag of Jean Grailly, the Captal de Buch, 5 silver shells on a black cross, which marked the presence of the most famous soldier of Gascony, while beside it waved the red lion of the noble knight of Hainault, Sir Eustace d'Ambreticourt. Those 2 coats Nigel knew, as did every warrior in Europe, but a dense grove of pennoned lances surrounded them, bearing charges which were strange to him, from which he understood that these belonged to the Guienne division of the army. Farther down the line the famous English ensigns floated on the wind, the scarlet and gold of Warwick, the silver star of Oxford, the golden cross of Suffolk, the blue and gold of Willoughby, and the gold-fretted scarlet of Audley. In the very centre of them all was one which caused all others to pass from his mind, for close to the royal banner of England, crossed with the label of the Prince, there waved the war-torn flag with the red wedge upon the golden field which marked the quarters of the noble Chandos. At the sight Nigel set spurs to his horse, and a few minutes later had reached the spot. Chandos, gaunt from hunger and want of sleep, but with the old fire lurking in his eye, was standing by the Prince's tent, gazing down at what could be seen of the French array, and heavy with thought. Nigel sprang from his horse and was within touch of his master when the silken hanging of the royal tent was torn violently aside and Edward rushed out. He was without his armor and clad in a sober suit of black, but the high dignity of his bearing and the imperious anger which flushed his face proclaimed the leader and the Prince. At his heels was a little white-haired ecclesiastic in a flowing gown of scarlet sendal, expostulating and arguing in a torrent of words.
"Not another word, my Lord Cardinal," cried the angry Prince. "I have listened to you overlong, and by God's dignity that which you say is neither good nor fair in my ears. Hark you, John, I would have your counsel. What think you is the message which my Lord Cardinal of Périgord has carried from the King of France? He says that of his clemency he will let my army pass back to Bordeaux if we will restore to him all that we have taken, remit all ransoms, and surrender my own person with that of 100 nobles of England and Guienne to be held as prisoners. What think you, John?"
Chandos smiled. "Things are not done in that fashion," said he.
"But, my Lord Chandos," cried the Cardinal, "I have made it clear to the Prince that indeed it is a scandal to all Christendom and a cause of mocking to the heathen that two great sons of the Church should turn their swords thus upon each other."
"Then bid the King of France to keep clear of us," said the Prince.
"Fair son, you are aware that you were in the heart of his country, and that it standeth not aright that he should suffer you to go forth as you came. You have but a small army, 3,000 bowmen and 5,000 men-at-arms at the most, who seem in evil case for want of food and rest. The King has 30,000 men at his back, of which 20,000 are expert men-at-arms. It is fitting, therefore, that you make such terms as you may, lest worse befall."
"Give my greetings to the King of France, and tell him that England will never pay ransom for me. But it seems to me, my Lord Cardinal, that you have our numbers and condition very readily upon your tongue, and I would fain know how the eye of a churchman can read a line of battle so easily. I have seen that these knights of your household have walked freely to and fro within our camp, and I much fear that when I welcomed you as envoys, I have in truth given my protection to spies. How say you, my Lord Cardinal?"
"Fair Prince, I know not how you can find it in your heart or conscience to say such evil words."
"There is this red-bearded nephew of thine, Robert de Duras. See where he stands yonder, counting and prying. Hark hither, young sir. I have been saying to your uncle the Cardinal that it is in my mind that you and your comrades have carried news of our dispositions to the French King. How say you?"
The knight turned pale and sank his eyes. "My lord," he murmured, "it may be that I have answered some questions."
"And how will such answers accord with your honor, seeing that we have trusted you since you came in the train of the Cardinal?"
"My lord, it is true that I am in the train of the Cardinal, and yet I am liegeman of King John and a knight of France, so I pray you to assuage your wrath against me." The Prince ground his teeth, and his piercing eyes blazed upon the youth.
"By my father's soul, I can scarce forbear to strike you to the earth. But this I promise you, that if you show that sign of the Red Griffin in the field, and if you be taken alive in tomorrow's battle, your head shall most assuredly be shorn from your shoulders."
"Fair son, indeed you speak wildly," cried the Cardinal. "I pledge you my word that neither my nephew Robert nor any of my train will take part in the battle. And now I leave you, sire, and may God assoil your soul, for indeed in all this world no men stand in greater peril than you and those who are around you, and I rede you that you spend the night in such ghostly exercises as may best prepare you for that which may befall."
So saying, the Cardinal bowed, and with his household walking behind him, set off for the spot where they had left their horses, whence they rode to the neighboring abbey. The angry Prince turned upon his heel and entered his tent once more, whilst Chandos, glancing round, held out a warm welcoming hand to Nigel. "I have heard much of your noble deeds," said he. "Already your name rises as a squire errant. I stood no higher, nor so high at your age." Nigel flushed with pride and pleasure. "Indeed, my dear lord, it is very little that I have done. But now that I am back at your side, I hope that in truth I shall learn to bear myself in worthy fashion, for where else should I win honor if it not be under your banner?" "Truly, Nigel, you have come at a very good time for advancement. I cannot see how we can leave this spot without a great battle which will live in men's minds forever. In all our fights in France I cannot call to mind any in which they have been so strong or we so weak as now, so that there will be the more honor to be gained. I would that we had 2,000 more archers, but I doubt not that we shall give them much trouble ere they drive us from amidst these hedges. Have you seen the French?" "Nay, fair sir, I have but this moment arrived." "I was about to ride forth myself, to coast their army and observe their countenance. So come with me ere the night fall, and we shall see what we can of their order and dispositions." There was a truce betwixt the two forces for the day, on account of the ill-advised and useless interposition of the Cardinal of Périgord. Hence, when Chandos and Nigel had pushed their horses through the long hedge which fronted the position, they found that many small parties of the knights of either army were riding up and down on the plain outside. The greater number of these groups were French, since it was very necessary for them to know as much as possible of the English defences, and many of their scouts had ridden up to within 100 yards of the hedge, where they were sternly ordered back by the pickets of archers on guard. Through these scattered knots of horsemen Chandos rode, and as many of them were old antagonists, it was "Ha, John" on the one side and "Ha, Roll! Ha, Nicholas! Ha, Guichard!" upon the other, as they brushed past them. Only one cavalier greeted them amiss, a large red-faced man, the Lord Clermont, who by some strange chance bore upon his surcoat a blue virgin standing amid golden sunbeams, which was the very device which Chandos had donned for the day. The fiery Frenchman dashed across their path and drew his steed back onto its haunches. "How long is it, my Lord Chandos," said he hotly, "since you have taken it upon yourself to wear my arms?" Chandos smiled. "It is surely you who have mine," said he, "since this surcoat was worked for me by the good nuns of Windsor a long year ago." "If it were not for the truce," said Clermont, "I would soon show you that you have no right to wear it." "Look for it then in the battle tomorrow, and I also will look for yours," Chandos answered. "Then we can very honorably settle the matter." But the Frenchman was choleric and hard to appease. "You English can invent nothing," said he, "and you take for your own whatever you see handsome belonging to others." So, grumbling and fuming, he rode upon his way, while Chandos, laughing gaily, spurred onward across the plain. The immediate front of the English line was shrouded with scattered trees and bushes, which hid the enemy. But when they had cleared these, a fair view of the great French army lay before them. In the center of the huge camp was a long and high pavilion of red silk, with the silver lilies of the king at one end of it, and the golden oriflamme, the battle flag of old France, at the other. Like the reeds of a pool, from side to side of the broad array, and dwindling away as far as their eyes could see, were the banners and pennons of high barons and famous knights. But above them all flew the ducal standards, which showed that the feudal muster of all the warlike provinces of France was in the field before them. With a kindling eye Chandos looked across at the proud ensigns of Normandy, of Burgundy, of Auvergne, of Champagne, of Vermandois, and of Berry, flaunting and gleaming in the rays of the sinking sun. Riding slowly down the line, he marked with attentive gaze the camp of the crossbowmen, the muster of the German mercenaries, the numbers of the foot soldiers, the arms of every proud vassal of Vavasseur, which might give some guide as to the power of each division. From wing to wing and round the flanks he went, keeping ever within crossbow shot of the army, and then, at last, having noted all things in his mind, he turned his horse's head and rode slowly back, heavy with thought, to the English lines. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Sir Nigel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Clive Catterall. Sir Nigel by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Chapter 25. How the King of France held council at Maupertuis. The morning of Sunday, the 19th of September, in the year of our Lord 1356, was cold and fine. A haze which rose from the marshy valley of Muisson covered both camps and set the starving Englishmen shivering, but it cleared slowly away as the sun rose. In the red silken pavilion of the French king, the same which had been viewed by Nigel and Chandos the evening before, a solemn mass was held by the Bishop of Chalons, who prayed for those who were about to die, with little thought in his mind that his own last hour was so near at hand. Then, when communion had been taken by the king and his 4 young sons, the altar was cleared away, and a great red-covered table placed lengthwise down the tent, round which John might assemble his council and determine how best he should proceed. With the silken roof, rich tapestries of Arras round the walls, and Eastern rugs beneath the feet, his palace could furnish no fairer chamber. King John, who sat upon the canopied dais at the upper end, was now in the 6th year of his reign and the 36th year of his life. He was a short, burly man, ruddy-faced and deep-chested, with dark, kindly eyes and a most noble bearing. It did not need the blue cloak sewed with silver lilies to mark him as the king. Though his reign had been short, his fame was already widespread over all Europe as a kindly gentleman and a fearless soldier, a fit leader for a chivalrous nation. His elder son, the Duke of Normandy, still hardly more than a boy, stood beside him, his hand upon the king's shoulder, and John half turned from time to time to fondle him. On the right, at the same high dais, was the king's younger brother, the Duke of Orleans, a pale, heavy-featured man with a languid manner and intolerant eyes. On the left was the Duke of Bourbon, sad-faced and absorbed, with that gentle melancholy in his eyes and bearing which comes often with a premonition of death. All these were in their armor, save only for their helmets, which lay upon the board before them. Below, grouped around the long red table, was an assembly of the most famous warriors in Europe. At the end nearest the king was the veteran soldier, the Duke of Athens, son of a banished father, and now High Constable of France. On one side of him sat the red-faced and choleric Lord Clermont, with the same blue virgin in gold rays upon his surcoat, which had caused his quarrel with Chandos the night before. On the other was a noble-featured, grizzly-haired soldier, Arnold d'Andreghen, who shared with Clermont the honor of being Marshal of France. Next to them sat Lord James of Bourbon, a brave warrior who was afterwards slain by the White Company at Grigny, and beside him a little group of German noblemen, including the Earl of Salzburg and the Earl of Nassau, who had ridden over the frontier with their formidable mercenaries at the bidding of the French king. The ridged armor and the hanging nasals of their bassinets were enough in themselves to tell every soldier that they were from beyond the Rhine. At the other side of the table were a line of proud and warlike lords: Fienne, Chatillon, Nesle, de Landas, de Beaujeu, with the fierce knight-errant de Charny, who had planned the surprise of Calais, and Eustace de Ribeaumont, who had, upon the same occasion, won the prize of valor from the hands of Edward of England. Such were the chiefs to whom the king now turned for assistance and advice. "You have already heard, my friends," said he, "that the Prince of Wales has made no answer to the proposal which we sent by the Lord Cardinal of Perigord. Certes, this is as it should be, and though I have obeyed the call of Holy Church, I had no fears that so excellent a prince as Edward of England would refuse to meet us in battle. I am now of opinion that we should fall upon them at once, lest perchance the Cardinal's cross should again come betwixt our swords and our enemies." A buzz of joyful assent arose from the meeting, and even from the attendant men-at-arms who guarded the door. When it had died away, the Duke of Orleans rose in his place beside the king. "Sire," said he, "you speak as we would have you do, and I, for one, am of opinion that the Cardinal of Perigord has been an ill friend of France, for why should we bargain for a part when we have but to hold out our hand in order to grasp the whole? What need is there for words? Let us spring to horse forthwith and ride over this handful of marauders who have dared to lay waste your fair dominions. If one of them go hence, save as our prisoner, we are the more to blame." "By Saint Denis, brother," said the king, smiling, "if words could slay, you would have had them upon their backs ere ever we left Chartres. You are new to war, but when you have had experience of a stricken field or two, you would know that things must be done with forethought and in order, or they may go awry. In our father's time we sprang to horse and spurred upon these English at Crecy and elsewhere, as you advise, but we had little profit from it, and now we are grown wiser. How say you, Seigneur de Ribeaumont? You have coasted their lines and observed their countenance. Would you ride down upon them, as my brother has advised, or how would you order the matter?" De Ribeaumont, a tall, dark-eyed, handsome man, paused ere he answered. "Sire," he said at last, "I have indeed ridden along their front and down their flanks in company with Lord Landas and Lord de Beaujeu,
who are here at your council to witness what I say. Indeed, sire, it is in my mind that though the English are few in numbers, yet they are in such a position amongst these hedges and vines that you would be well advised if you were to leave them alone, for they have no food and must retreat, so that you will be able to follow them and to fight them to better advantage." A murmur of disapproval rose from the company, and the Lord Clermont, Marshal of the army, sprang to his feet, his face red with anger. "Eustace, Eustace," said he, "I bear in mind the days when you were of great heart and high enterprise, but since King Edward gave you yonder chaplet of pearls, you have ever been backward against the English." "My Lord Clermont," said de Ribeaumont sternly, "it is not for me to brawl at the King's council and in the face of the enemy, but we will go further into this matter at some other time. Meanwhile, the King has asked me for my advice, and I have given it as best I might." "It had been better for your honor, Sir Eustace, had you held your peace," said the Duke of Orleans. "Shall we let them slip from our fingers when we have them here and are fourfold their number? I know not where we should dwell afterwards, for I am very sure that we should be ashamed to ride back to Paris or to look our ladies in the eyes again." "Indeed, Eustace, you have done very well to say what is in your mind," said the King. "But I have already said that we shall join battle this morning, so that there is no room here for further talk. But I would fain have heard from you how it would be wisest and best that we attack them." "I will advise you, sire, to the best of my power. Upon their right is a river with marshes around it, and upon their left a great wood, so that we can advance only upon the center. Along their front is a thick hedge, and behind it I saw the green jerkins of their archers, as thick as the sedges by the river. It is broken by one road, where only 4 horsemen could ride abreast, which leads through the position. It is clear, then, that if we are to drive them back, we must cross the great hedge, and I am very sure that the horses will not face it, with such a storm of arrows beating from behind it. Therefore, it is my counsel that we fight upon foot, as the English did at Crécy, for indeed we may find that our horses will be more hindrance than help to us this day." "The same thought was in my own mind, sire," said Arnold Andreghen, the veteran marshal. "At Crécy the bravest had to turn their backs, for what can a man do with a horse which is mad with pain and fear? If we advance upon foot we are our own masters, and if we stop the shame is ours." "The counsel is good," said the Duke of Athens, turning his shrewd wizened face to the King. "But one thing only I would add to it. The strength of these people lies in their archers, and if we could throw them into disorder, were it only for a short time, we should win the hedge, else they will shoot so strongly that we must lose many men before we reach it, for indeed we have learned that no armor will keep out their shafts when they are close." "Your words, fair sir, are both good and wise," said the King, "but I pray you to tell us how you would throw these archers into disorder." "I would choose 300 horsemen, sire, the best and most forward in the army. With these I would ride up the narrow road, and so turn to right and left, falling upon the archers behind the hedge. It may be that the 300 would suffer sorely, but what are they amongst so great a host if a road may be cleared for their companions?" "I would say a word to that, sire," cried the German Count of Nassau. "I have come here with my comrades to venture our persons in your quarrel, but we claim the right to fight in our own fashion, and we would count it dishonor to dismount from our steeds out of fear of the arrows of the English. Therefore, with your permission, we will ride to the front, as the Duke of Athens has advised, and so clear a path for the rest of you." "This may not be," cried the Lord Clermont angrily. "It would be strange indeed if Frenchmen could not be found to clear a path for the army of the King of France. One would think, to hear you talk, my Lord Count, that your hardihood was greater than our own. But by Our Lady of Rocamadour, you will learn before nightfall that it is not so. It is for me, who am Marshal of France, to lead these 300, since it is an honorable venture." "And I claim the same right for the same reason," said Arnold of Andreghen. The German Count struck the table with a mailed fist. "Do what you like," said he, "but this only I can promise you, that neither I nor any of my German riders will descend from our horses so long as they are able to carry us, For in our country it is only people of no consequence who fight upon their feet." The Lord Clermont was leaning angrily forward with some hot reply when King John intervened. "Enough, enough," he said. "It is for you to give your opinions and for me to tell you what to do. Lord Clermont, and you, Arnold, you will choose 300 of the bravest cavaliers in the army, and you will endeavor to break these archers. As to you and your Germans, my Lord Nassau, you will remain on horseback, since you desire it, and you will follow the marshals and support them as best you may. The rest of the army will advance upon foot in 3 other divisions, as arranged. Yours, Charles," and he patted his son, the Duke of Normandy, affectionately upon the hand. "Yours, Philip," he glanced at the Duke of Orleans, "and the main battle, which is my own. To you, Geoffrey de Charny, I entrust the Oriflamme this day. But who is this knight, and what does he desire?" A young knight, ruddy bearded and tall, a red griffin upon his surcoat, had appeared in the opening of the tent. His flushed face and dishevelled dress showed that he had come in haste. "Sire," said he, "I am Robert de Duras, of the household of the Cardinal of Perigord. I have told you yesterday all that I have learned of the English camp. This morning I was again admitted to it, and I have seen their wagons moving to the rear. Sire, they are in flight for Bordeaux." "'Fore God, I knew it!" cried the Duke of Orleans in a voice of fury. "Whilst we have been talking they have slipped through our fingers. Did I not warn you?" "Be silent, Philip," said the King angrily. "But you, sir, have you seen this with your own eyes?" "With my own eyes, sire, and I have ridden straight from their camp." King John looked at him with a stern gaze. "I know not how it accords with your honor to carry such tidings in such fashion," said he, "but we cannot choose but to take advantage of it. Fear not, brother Philip. It is in my mind that you will see all that you would wish of the Englishmen before nightfall. Should we fall upon them whilst they cross the ford, it will be to our advantage. Now, fair sirs, I pray you to hasten to your posts and to carry out all that we have agreed. Advance the Oriflamme, Geoffrey, and do you marshal the divisions, Arnold. So may God and Saint Denis have us in their holy keeping this day." The Prince of Wales stood upon that little knoll where Nigel had halted the day before. Beside him were Chandos and a tall, sunburned warrior of middle age, the Gascon Captal de Buch. The 3 men were all attentively watching the distant French lines, while behind them a column of wagons wound down to the ford of the Muisson. Close in the rear 4 knights in full armor with open visors sat their horses and conversed in undertones with each other. A glance at their shields would have given their names to any soldier, for they were all men of fame who had seen much warfare. At present they were awaiting their orders, for each of them commanded the whole or part of a division of the army. The youth upon the left, dark, slim and earnest, was William Montacute, Earl of Salisbury, only 28 years of age and yet a veteran of Crecy. How high he stood in reputation is shown by the fact that the command of the rear, the post of honor in a retreating army, had been given to him by the Prince. He was talking to a grizzled, hard-faced man, somewhat over middle age, with lion features and fierce light blue eyes which gleamed as they watched their distant enemy. It was the famous Robert de Ufford, Earl of Suffolk, who had fought without a break from Cadsand onward through the whole Continental War. The other tall soldier, with the silver star gleaming upon his surcoat, was John de Vere, Earl of Oxford, and he listened to the talk of Thomas Beauchamp, a burly, jovial, ruddy nobleman and a tried soldier, who leaned forward and tapped his mailed hand upon the other's steel-clad thigh. They were old battle companions, of the same age and in the very prime of life, with equal fame and equal experience of the wars. Such was the group of famous English soldiers who sat their horses behind the Prince and waited for their orders. "I would that you had laid hands upon him," said the Prince angrily, continuing his conversation with Chandos, "and yet perchance it was wiser to play this trick and make them think that we are retreating." "He has certainly carried the tidings," said Chandos with a smile. "No sooner had the wagons started than I saw him gallop down the edge of the wood." "It was well thought of, John," the Prince remarked, for it would indeed be great comfort if we could turn their own spy against them. Unless they advance upon us, I know not how we can hold out another day, for there is not a loaf left in the army. And yet if we leave this position, where shall we hope to find such another?"
"They will stoop, fair sir, they will stoop to our lure. Even now Robert de Duras will be telling them that the wagons are on the move, and they will hasten to overtake us lest we pass the ford. But who is this? Who rides so fast? Here, perchance, may be tidings."
A horseman had spurred up to the knoll. He sprang from the saddle and sank on one knee before the prince. "How now, my Lord Audley?" said Edward. "What would you have?"
"Sir," said the knight, still kneeling with bowed head before his leader, "I have a boon to ask of you."
"Nay, James, rise. Let me hear what I can do."
The famous knight errant, pattern of chivalry for all time, rose and turned his swarthy face and dark, earnest eyes upon his master. "Sir," said he, "I have ever served most loyally my lord your father and yourself, and shall continue to do so as long as I have life. Dear sir, I must now acquaint you that formerly I made a vow that if ever I should be in any battle under your command, that I would be foremost or die in the attempt. I beg, therefore, that you will graciously permit me to honorably quit my place among the others, that I may post myself in such wise as to accomplish my vow." The prince smiled, for it was very sure that, vow or no vow, permission or no permission, Lord James Audley would still be in the van. "Go, James," said he, shaking his hand, "and God grant that this day you may shine in valor above all knights. But hark, John, what is that?" Chandos cast up his fierce nose like the eagle which smells slaughter afar.
"Surely, sir, all is forming even as we had planned it."
From far away there came a thunderous shout, then another and yet another.
"See, they are moving!" cried the Captal de Buch.
All morning they had watched the gleam of the armed squadrons who were drawn up in front of the French camp. Now, whilst a great blare of trumpets was borne to their ears, the distant masses flickered and twinkled in the sunlight. "Yes, yes, they are moving!" cried the prince.
"They are moving! They are moving!"
Down the line the murmur ran, and then with a sudden impulse the archers at the hedge sprang to their feet, and the knights behind them waved their weapons in the air, while one tremendous shout of warlike joy carried their defiance to the approaching enemy. Then there fell such a silence that the pawing of the horses or the jingle of their harness struck loud upon the ear, until amid the hush there rose a low, deep roar like the sound of the tide upon the beach, ever growing. Chapter 26 of Sir Nigel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Clive Catterall. Sir Nigel by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Chapter 26. How Nigel found his third deed. 4 archers lay behind a clump of bushes 10 yards in front of the thick hedge which shielded their companions. Amid the long line of bowmen, those behind them were their own company, and in the main the same who were with Knolles in Brittany. The 4 in front were their leaders: old Wat of Carlisle, Ned Widdington the red-headed dalesman, the bald bowyer Bartholomew, and Samkin Aylward, newly rejoined after a week's absence. All 4 were munching bread and apples, for Aylward had brought in a full haversack and divided them freely amongst his starving comrades. The old borderer and the Yorkshireman were gaunt and hollow-eyed with privation, while the bowyer's round face had fallen in so that the skin hung in loose pouches under his eyes and beneath his jaws. Behind them, lines of haggard, wolfish men glared through the underwood, silent and watchful, save that they burst into a fierce yelp of welcome when Chandos and Nigel galloped up, sprang from their horses, and took their station beneath them. All along the green fringe of bowmen might be seen the steel-clad figures of knights and squires who had pushed their way into the front line to share the fortune of the archers.
I call to mind that I once shot 6 hens with the Kentish woldsman at Ashford," began the bowyer. "Nay, nay, we have heard that story," said old Wat impatiently. "Shut thy clap, Bartholomew, for it is no time for reedless gossip. Walk down the line, I pray you, and see if there be no frayed string, nor broken nock, nor loosened whipping to be mended." The stout bowyer passed down the fringe of bowmen, amidst a running fire of rough wit. Here and there a bow was thrust out at him through the hedge for his professional advice. "Wax your heads," he kept crying. "Pass down the wax pot and wax your heads. A waxed arrow will pass where a dry will be held. Tom Beverley, you jack fool, where is your bracer guard? Your string will flay your arm ere you reach your upshot this day. And you, Watkin, draw not to your mouth, as is your wont, but to your shoulder. You're so used to the wine pot that the string must needs follow it. Nay, stand loose and give space for your drawing arms, for they will be upon us anon." He ran back and joined his comrades in the front, who had now risen to their feet. Behind them a half-mile of archers stood behind the hedge, each with his great warbow strung, 6 shafts loose behind him, and 18 more in the quiver slung across his front. With arrow on string, their feet firm planted, their fierce, eager faces peering through the branches, they awaited the coming storm. The broad flood of steel, after oozing slowly forward, had stopped about a mile from the English front. The greater part of the army had then descended from their horses, while a crowd of varlets and hostlers led them to the rear. The French formed themselves now into 3 great divisions, which shimmered in the sun like silvery pools, reed-capped with many 1,000 of banners and pennons. A space of several hundred yards divided each. At the same time 2 bodies of horsemen formed themselves in front. The first consisted of 300 men in one thick column, the second of 1,000 riding in a more extended line. The Prince had ridden up to the line of archers. He was in dark armor, his visor open, and his handsome aquiline face all glowing with spirit and martial fire. The bowmen yelled at him, and he waved his hands to them as a huntsman cheers his hounds. "Well, John, what think you now?" he asked. "What would my noble father not give to be by our side this day? Have you seen that they have left their horses?" "Yes, my fair lord, they have learned their lesson," said Chandos. "Because we have had good fortune upon our feet at Crecy and elsewhere, they think that they have found the trick of it. But it is in my mind that it is very different to stand when you are assailed, as we have done, and to assail others when you must drag your harness for a mile and come weary to the fray." "You speak wisely, John. But these horsemen who form in front and ride slowly towards us, what make you of them?" "Doubtless they hope to cut the strings of our bowmen, and so clear a way for the others. But they are indeed a chosen band, for mark you, fair sir, are not those the colours of Clermont upon the left and of d'Andreghen upon the right, so that both marshals ride with the vanguard?" "By God's soul, John," cried the Prince, "it is very sure that you can see more with one eye than any man in this army with 2. "But it is even as you say. And this larger band behind?" "They should be Germans, fair sir, by the fashion of their harness." The 2 bodies of horsemen had moved slowly over the plain, with a space of nearly a quarter of a mile between them. Now, having come 2 bowshots from the hostile line, they halted. All that they could see of the English was the long hedge, with an occasional twinkle of steel through its leafy branches, and behind that the spearheads of the men-at-arms rising from amidst the brushwood and the vines. A lovely autumn countryside with changing, many-tinted foliage lay stretched before them, all bathed in peaceful sunshine, and nothing, save those flickering fitful gleams, to tell of the silent and lurking enemy who barred their way. But the bold spirit of the French cavaliers rose the higher to the danger. The clamor of their war cries filled the air, and they tossed their pennoned spears over their heads in menace and defiance. From the English line it was a noble sight. The gallant, pawing, curvetting horses, the many-colored twinkling riders, the swoop and wave and toss of plume and banner. Then a bugle rang forth. With a sudden yell, Every spur struck deep, every lance was laid in rest, and the whole gallant squadron flew like a glittering thunderbolt for the centre of the English line. 100 yards they had crossed, and yet another 100, but there was no movement in front of them, and no sound save their own hoarse battle cries and the thunder of their horses. Ever swifter and swifter they flew. From behind the hedge it was a vision of horses, white, bay, and black, their necks stretched, their nostrils distended, their bellies to the ground, whilst of the rider one could but see a shield with a plume-tufted visor above it, and a spearhead twinkling in the front. Then of a sudden the prince raised his hand and gave a cry. Chandos echoed it. It swelled down the line, and with one mighty chorus of twanging strings and hissing shafts, the long-pent storm broke at last. Alas for the noble steeds! Alas for the gallant men! When the lust of battle is over, who would not grieve to see that noble squadron break into red ruin before the rain of arrows beating upon the faces and breasts of the horses? The front rank crashed down, and the others piled themselves upon the top of them, unable to check their speed or to swerve aside from the terrible wall of their shattered comrades which had so suddenly sprung up before them. 15 feet high was that blood-spurting mound of screaming, kicking horses and writhing, struggling men. Here and there on the flanks a horseman cleared himself and dashed for the hedge, only to have his steed slain under him and to be hurled from his saddle. Of all the 300 gallant riders, not one ever reached that fatal hedge. But now, in a long rolling wave of steel, the German battalion roared swiftly onward. They opened in the centre to pass that terrible mound of death, and then spurred swiftly in upon the archers. They were brave men, well led, and in their open lines they could avoid the clubbing together which had been the ruin of the vanguard. Yet they perished singly, even as the others had perished together. A few were slain by the arrows. The greater number had their horses killed under them, and were so shaken and shattered by the fall that they could not raise their limbs, overweighted with iron, from the spot where they lay. 3 men, riding together, broke through the bushes which sheltered the leaders of the archers, cut down Widdington the dalesman, spurred onward through the hedge, dashed over the bowmen behind it, and made for the prince. One fell with an arrow through his head, a second was beaten from his saddle by Chandos, and a third was slain by the prince's own hand. A second band broke through near the river, but were cut off by Lord Audley and his squires, so that all were slain. A single horseman, whose steed was mad with pain, an arrow in its eye and a second in its nostril, sprang over the hedge and clattered through the whole army, disappearing amid whoops and laughter into the woods behind. But none others won as far as the hedge. The whole front of the position was fringed with a litter of German wounded or dead, while one great heap in the centre marked the downfall of the gallant French 300. Whilst these 2 waves of the attack had broken in front of the English position, leaving this blood-stained wreckage behind them, the main divisions had halted and made their last preparations for their own assault. They had not yet begun their advance, and the nearest was still half a mile distant, when a few survivors from the forlorn hope, their maddened horses bristling with arrows, flew past them on either flank. At the same moment the English archers and men-at-arms dashed through the hedge and dragged all who were living out of that tangled heap of shattered horses and men. It was a mad, wild rush, for in a few minutes the fight must be renewed, and yet there was a rich harvest of wealth for the lucky man who could pick a wealthy prisoner from amid the crowd. The nobler spirits disdained to think of ransoms while the fight was still unsettled, but a swarm of needy soldiers, Gascons and English, dragged the wounded out by the leg or the arm, and with daggers at their throats demanded their names, titles, and means. He who had made a good prize hurried him to the rear, where his own servants could guard him, while he who was disappointed too often drove the dagger home, and then rushed once more into the tangle in the hope of better luck. Clermont, with an arrow through the sky-blue Virgin on his surcoat, lay dead within 10 paces of the hedge. D'Andreghen was dragged by a penniless squire from under a horse and became his prisoner. The Earl of Salzburg and of Nassau were both found helpless on the ground and taken to the rear. Aylward cast his thick arms round Count Otto von Langenbeck,
and laid him, helpless from a broken leg, behind his bush. Black Simon had made prize of Bernard, Count of Ventadour, and hurried him through the hedge. Everywhere there was rushing and shouting, brawling and buffeting, while amid it all a swarm of archers were seeking their shafts, plucking them from the dead and sometimes even from the wounded. Then there was a sudden cry of warning. In a moment every man was back in his place once more, and the line of the hedge was clear. It was high time, for already the first division of the French was close upon them. If the charge of the horsemen had been terrible from its rush and its fire, this steady advance of a huge phalanx of armored footmen was even more fearsome to the spectator. They moved very slowly on account of the weight of their armor, but their progress was the more regular and inexorable. With elbows touching, their shields slung in front, their short 5-foot spears carried in their right hands, and their maces or swords ready at their belts, the deep column of men-at-arms moved onward. Again the storm of arrows beat upon them, clinking and thudding on the armor. They crouched double behind their shields as they met it. Many fell, but still the slow tide lapped onward. Yelling, they surged up to the hedge and lined it for half a mile, struggling hard to pierce it. For 5 minutes the long straining ranks faced each other with fierce stab of spear on one side and heavy beat of axe or mace upon the other. In many parts the hedge was pierced or levelled to the ground, and the French men-at-arms were raging amongst the archers, hacking and hewing among the lightly armed men. For a moment it seemed as if the battle was on the turn. But John de Vere, Earl of Oxford, cool, wise, and crafty in war, saw and seized his chance. On the right flank a marshy meadow skirted the river. So soft was it that a heavily armed man would sink to his knees. At his order a spray of light bowmen was thrown out from the battle line, and forming upon the flank of the French, poured their arrows into them. At the same moment Chandos, with Audley, Nigel, Bartholomew Burgash, the Captal de Buch, and a score of other knights, sprang upon their horses, and charging down the narrow lane, rode over the French line in front of them. Once through it, they spurred to left and right, trampling down the dismounted men-at-arms. A fearsome sight was Pommers that day, his red eyes rolling, his nostrils gaping, his tawny mane tossing, and his savage teeth gnashing in fury, as he tore and smashed and ground beneath his ramping hoofs all that came before him. Fearsome too was the rider, ice-cool, alert, concentrated of purpose, with heart of fire and muscles of steel. A very angel of battle he seemed as he drove his maddened horse through the thickest of the press. But strive as he would, the tall figure of his master upon his coal-black steed was ever half a length before him. Already the moment of danger was past. The French line had given back. Those who had pierced the hedge had fallen like brave men amid the ranks of their foemen. The division of Warwick had hurried up from the vineyards to fill the gaps of Salisbury's battle line. Back rolled the shining tide, slowly at first, even as it had advanced, but quicker now as the bolder fell and the weaker shredded out and shuffled with ungainly speed for a place of safety. Again there was a rush from behind the hedge. Again there was a reaping of that strange crop of bearded arrows which grew so thick upon the ground, and again the wounded prisoners were seized and dragged in brutal haste to the rear. Then the line was restored, and the English, weary, panting, and shaken, awaited the next attack. But a great good fortune had come to them, so great that as they looked down the valley they could scarce credit their own senses. Behind the division of the Dauphin, which had pressed them so hard, stood a second division, hardly less numerous, led by the Duke of Orleans. The fugitives from in front, blood-smeared and bedraggled, blinded with sweat and with fear, rushed amidst its ranks in their flight, and in a moment, without a blow being struck, had carried them off in their wild rout. This vast array, so solid and so martial, thawed suddenly away like a snow wreath in the sun. It was gone, and in its place thousands of shining dots scattered over the whole plain, as each man made his own way to the spot where he could find his horse and bear himself from the field. For a moment it seemed that the battle was won, and a thunder shout of joy pealed up from the English line. But as the curtain of the Duke's division was drawn away, it was only to disclose, stretching far behind it and spanning the valley from side to side, the magnificent array of the French king, solid, unshaken, and preparing its ranks for the attack. Its numbers were as great as those of the English army. It was unscathed by all that was past, and it had a valiant monarch to lead it to the charge. With the slow deliberation of the man who means to do or to die, its leader marshalled its ranks for the supreme effort of the day. Meanwhile, during that brief moment of exultation when the battle appeared to be won, a crowd of hot-headed young knights and squires swarmed and clamored round the prince, beseeching that he would allow them to ride forth. "See this insolent fellow who bears 3 martlets upon a field gules," cried Sir Maurice Berkeley. "He stands betwixt 2 armies as though he had no dread of us." "I pray you, sir, that I may ride out to him, since he seems ready to attempt some small deed," pleaded Nigel. "Nay, fair sirs, it is an evil thing that we should break our line, seeing that we still have much to do," said the prince. "See, he rides away, and so the matter is settled." "Nay, fair prince," said the young knight who had spoken first, "my gray horse Le Bright could run him down ere he could reach shelter. Never since I left Severn's side have I seen steed so fleet as mine. Shall I not show you?" In an instant he had spurred the charger and was speeding across the plain. The Frenchman, John de Hélène, a squire of Picardy, had waited with a burning heart, his soul sick at the flight of the division in which he had ridden. In the hope of doing some redeeming exploit, or of meeting his own death, he had loitered betwixt the armies, but no movement had come from the English lines. Now he had turned his horse's head to join the king's array, when the low drumming of hoofs sounded behind him, and he turned to find a horseman hard upon his heels. Each had drawn his sword, and the 2 armies paused to view the fight. In the first bout, Sir Maurice Berkeley's lance was struck from his hand, and as he sprang down to recover it, the Frenchman ran him through the thigh, dismounted from his horse, and received his surrender. As the unfortunate Englishman hobbled away at the side of his captor, a roar of laughter burst from both armies at the spectacle.
"By my 10 finger bones!" cried Aylward, chuckling from behind the remains of his bush. "He found more on his distaff that time than he knew how to spin. Who was the knight?"
"By his arms," said old Wat, "he should either be a Berkeley of the West or a Popham of Kent." "I call to mind that I shot a match of 6 ends once with a Kentish woldsman," began the fat bowyer. Nay, stint thy talk, Bartholomew," cried old Wat. "Here is poor Ned with his head cloven, and it would be more fitting if he were saying Aves for his soul instead of all this bobbance and boasting. Now, Tom of Beverley, we have suffered sorely in this last bout, Wat. There are 40 of our men upon their backs, and the Dean Foresters on the right are in worse case still." "Talking will not mend it, Tom, and if all but one were on their backs he must still hold his ground." Whilst the archers were chatting, the leaders of the army were in solemn conclave just behind them. 2 divisions of the French had been repulsed, and yet there was many an anxious face as the older knights looked across the plain at the unbroken array of the French king moving slowly towards them. The line of the archers was much thinned and shredded. Many knights and squires had been disabled in the long and fierce combat at the hedge. Others, exhausted by want of food, had no strength left and were stretched panting upon the ground. Some were engaged in carrying the wounded to the rear and laying them under the shelter of the trees, whilst others were replacing their broken swords or lances from the weapons of the slain. The Captal de Buch, brave and experienced as he was, frowned darkly and whispered his misgivings to Chandos. But the prince's courage flamed the higher as the shadow fell, while his dark eyes gleamed with a soldier's pride as he glanced round him at his weary comrades, and then at the dense masses of the king's battle, which now, with 100 trumpets blaring and 1,000 pennons waving, rolled slowly over the plain. "Come what may, John, this has been a most noble meeting," said he. "They will not be ashamed of us in England. Take heart, my friends, for if we conquer, we shall carry the glory ever with us, but if we be slain, then we die most worshipfully and in high honor, as we have ever prayed that we might die, as we leave behind us our brothers and kinsmen who will assuredly avenge us."
It is but one more effort, and all will be well. Warwick, Oxford, Salisbury, Suffolk, every man to the front. My banner to the front also. Your horses, fair sirs. The archers are spent, and our own good lances must win the field this day. Advance, Walter, and may God and St. George be with England." Sir Walter Woodland, riding a high black horse, took station by the Prince, with the royal banner resting in a socket by his saddle. From all sides the knights and squires crowded in upon it, until they formed a great squadron containing the survivors of the battalions of Warwick and Salisbury, as well as those of the Prince. 400 men-at-arms, who had been held in reserve, were brought up and thickened the array. But even so, Chandos' face was grave as he scanned it, and then turned his eyes upon the masses of the Frenchmen. "I like it not, fair sir. The weight is overgreat," he whispered to the Prince. "How would you order it, John? Speak what is in your mind." "We should attempt something upon their flank, whilst we hold them in front. How say you, Jean?" He turned to the Counsel de Buch, whose dark, resolute face reflected the same misgivings. "Indeed, John, I think as you do," said he. "The French king is a very valiant man, and so are those who are about him, and I know not how we may drive them back unless we can do as you advise. If you will give me only 100 men, I will attempt it." "Surely the task is mine, fair sir, since the thought was come from me." "Nay, John, I would keep you at my side. But you speak well, Jean, and you shall do even as you have said. Go ask the Earl of Oxford for 100 men-at-arms and as many hobblers, that you may ride round the mound yonder and so fall upon them unseen. Let all that are left of the archers gather on each side, shoot away their arrows, and then fight as best they may. Wait till they are past yonder thorn bush, and then, Walter, bear my banner straight against that of the King of France. Fair sirs, may God and the thought of your ladies hold high your hearts." The French monarch, seeing that his footmen had made no impression upon the English, and also that the hedge had been well nigh level to the ground in the course of the combat, so that it no longer presented an obstacle, had ordered his followers to remount their horses, and it was as a solid mass of cavalry that the chivalry of France advanced to their last supreme effort. The king was in the center of the front line, Geoffrey de Charny with the golden oriflamme upon his right, and Eustace de Ribeaumont with the royal lilies upon the left. At his elbow was the Duke of Athens, High Constable of France, and round him were the nobles of the court, fiery and furious, yelling their war cries as they waved their weapons over their heads. 6,000 gallant men of the bravest race in Europe, men whose very names are like blasts of a battle trumpet, Beaujeu and Châtillon, Tancarville and Ventadour, pressed hard behind the silver lilies. Slowly they moved at first, walking their horses that they might be fresher for the shock. Then they broke into a trot, which was quickening into a gallop when the remains of the hedge in front of them was beaten in an instant to the ground, and the broad line of the steel-clad chivalry of England swept grandly forth to the final shock. With loose rein and busy spur, the two lines of horsemen galloped at the top of their speed, straight and hard for each other. An instant later they met with a thunder crash, which was heard by the burghers on the wall of Poitiers, 7 good miles away. Under that frightful impact, horses fell dead with broken necks, and many a rider, held in his saddle by the high pommel, fractured his thighs with the shock. Here and there a pair met breast to breast, the horses rearing straight upward and falling back upon their masters. But for the most part the line had opened in the gallop, and the cavaliers, flying through the gaps, buried themselves in the enemy's ranks. Then the flanks shredded out, and the thick press in the center loosened until there was space to swing a sword and to guide a steed. For 10 acres there was one wild, tumultuous swirl of tossing heads, of gleaming weapons which rose and fell, of upthrown hands, of tossing plumes, and of lifted shields, whilst the din of 1,000 war cries and the clash of metal upon metal rose and swelled like the roar and beat of an ocean surge upon a rock-bound coast. Backward and forward swayed the mighty throng, now down the valley, now up, as each side in turn put forth its strength for a fresh rally. Locked in one long deadly grapple, great England and gallant France, with iron hearts and souls of fire, strove and strove for mastery. Sir Walter Woodland, riding hard upon his high black horse, had plunged into the swelter and headed for the blue and silver banner of King John. Close at his heels, in a solid wedge,
rode the Prince, Chandos, Nigel, Lord Reginald Cobham, Audley with his 4 famous squires, and a score of the flower of the English and Gascon knighthood. Holding together and bearing down opposition by a shower of blows and by the weight of their powerful horses, their progress was still very slow, for ever fresh waves of French cavaliers surged up against them and broke in front, only to close in again upon their rear. Sometimes they were swept backwards by the rush, sometimes they gained a few paces, sometimes they could but keep their foothold, and yet from minute to minute that blue and silver flag, which waved above the press, grew ever a little closer. A dozen furious, hard-breathing French knights had broken into their ranks and clutched at Sir Walter Woodland's banner, but Chandos and Nigel guarded it on one side, Audley with his squires on the other, so that no man laid his hand upon it and lived. But now there was a distant crash and a roar of "St. George for England" from behind. The Captal de Buch had charged home. "St. George for England!" yelled the main attack, and ever the counter-cry came back from them from afar. The ranks opened in front of them. The French were giving way. A small knight with a golden scrollwork upon his armor threw himself upon the Prince and was struck dead by his mace. It was the Duke of Athens, Constable of France, but none had time to note it, and the fight rolled on over his body. Looser still were the French ranks. Many were turning their horses, for that ominous roar from the rear had shaken their resolution. The little English wedge poured onward, the Prince, Chandos, Audley and Nigel ever in the van. A huge warrior in black, bearing a golden banner, appeared suddenly in a gap of the shredding ranks. He tossed his precious burden to a squire, who bore it away. Like a pack of hounds on the very haunch of a deer, the English rushed, yelling for the oriflamme. But the black warrior flung himself across their path. "Charny, Charny à la recousse!" he roared with a voice of thunder. Sir Reginald Cobham dropped before his battle-axe. So did the Gascon de Clisson. Nigel was beaten down on the crupper of his horse by a sweeping blow, but at the same instant Chandos's quick blade passed through the Frenchman's camail and pierced his throat. So died Geoffrey de Charny, but the oriflamme was saved. Dazed with shock, Nigel still kept his saddle, and Pommers, his yellow hide mottled with blood, bore him onward with the others. The French horsemen were now in full flight, but one stern group of knights stood firm, like a rock in a rushing torrent, beating off all, whether friend or foe, who tried to break their ranks. The oriflamme had gone, and so had the blue and silver banner, but here were desperate men ready to fight to the death. In their ranks honor was to be reaped. The Prince and his following hurled themselves upon them, while the rest of the English horsemen swept onward to secure the fugitives and to win their ransoms. But the nobler spirits, Audley, Chandos and the others, would have thought it shame to gain money whilst there was work to be done or honor to be won. Furious was the wild attack, desperate the prolonged defense. Men fell from their saddles for very exhaustion. Nigel, still at his place near Chandos's elbow, was hotly attacked by a short, broad-shouldered warrior upon a stout white cob, but Pommers reared with pawing forefeet and dashed the smaller horse to the ground. The falling rider clutched Nigel's arm and tore him from the saddle, so that the two rolled upon the grass under the stamping hoofs, the English squire on the top, and his shortened sword glimmering before the visor of the gasping, breathless Frenchman. "Je me rends, j'accepte," he panted. For a moment a vision of rich ransoms passed through Nigel's brain. That noble palfrey, that gold-flecked armor meant fortune to the captor. Let others have it. There was work still to be done. How could he desert the Prince and his noble master for the sake of a private gain? Could he lead a prisoner to the rear when honor beckoned him to the van? He staggered to his feet, seized Pommers by the mane, and swung himself into the saddle. An instant later he was by Chandos's side once more, and they were bursting together through the last ranks of the gallant gallop who had fought so bravely to the end. Behind them was one long swathe of the dead and the wounded. In front the whole wide plain was covered with the flying French and their pursuers. The Prince reined up his steed and opened his visor, whilst his followers crowded round him with waving weapons and frenzied shouts of victory. "What now, John?" cried the smiling Prince.
wiping his streaming face with his ungauntleted hand. "How fares it then?"
"I am little hurt, fair lord, save for a crushed hand and a spear prick in the shoulder. But you, sir, I trust you have no scathe."
"In truth, John, with you at one elbow and Lord Audley at the other, I know not how I could come to harm. But alas, I fear that Sir James is sorely stricken."
The gallant Lord Audley had dropped upon the ground, and the blood oozed from every crevice of his battered armor. His 4 brave squires, Dutton of Dutton, Delves of Doddington, Foulhurst of Crewe, and Hawkstone of Wainhill, wounded and weary themselves, but with no thought save for their master, unlaced his helmet and bathed his pallid blood-stained face. He looked up at the Prince with burning eyes.
"I thank you, sir, for deigning to consider so poor a knight as myself," he said in a feeble voice.
The Prince dismounted and bent over him.
"I am bound to honor you very much, James," said he, "for by your valor this day you have won glory and renown above us all, and your prowess has proved you to be the bravest knight."
"My lord," murmured the wounded man, "you have a right to say what you please, but I wish it were as you say."
"James," said the Prince, "from this time onward I shall make you a knight of my own household, and I settle upon you 500 marks of yearly income from my own estates in England."
"Sir," the knight answered, "God make me worthy of the good fortune you bestow upon me. Your knight I will ever be, and the money I will divide with your leave amongst these 4 squires who have brought me whatever glory I have won this day." So saying, his head fell back, and he lay white and silent upon the grass.
"Bring water," said the Prince. "Let the royal leech see to him, for I had rather lose many men than the good Sir James. Chandos, what have we here?"
A knight lay across the path, with his helmet beaten down upon his shoulders. On his surcoat and shield were the arms of a red griffin.
"It is Robert de Duras, the spy," said Chandos.
"Well for him that he has met his end," said the angry Prince. "Put him on a shield, Hubert, and let 4 archers bear him to the monastery. Lay him at the feet of the Cardinal, and say that by this sign I greet him. Place my flag on yonder high bush, Walter, and let my tent be raised there, that my friends may know where to seek me."
The flight and pursuit had thundered far away, and the field was deserted, save for the numerous groups of weary horsemen who were making their way back, driving their prisoners before them. The archers were scattered over the whole plain, rifling the saddlebags and gathering the armor of those who had fallen, or searching for their own scattered arrows. Suddenly, however, as the Prince was turning toward the bush which he had chosen for his headquarters, there broke out from behind him an extraordinary uproar, and a group of knights and squires came pouring towards him, all arguing, swearing, and abusing each other in French and English at the tops of their voices. In the midst of them limped a stout little man in gold-spangled armor, who appeared to be the object of the contention, for one would drag him one way and one another, as though they would pull him limb from limb.
"Nay, fair sirs, gently, gently, I pray you," he pleaded. "There is enough for all, no need to treat me so rudely."
But ever the hubbub broke out again, and swords gleamed as the angry disputants glared furiously at each other. The Prince's eyes fell upon the small prisoner, and he staggered back with a gasp of astonishment.
"King John!"
he cried. A shout of joy rose from the warriors around him.
"The King of France! The King of France a prisoner!"
they cried in an ecstasy.
"Nay, nay, fair sirs, let him not hear that we rejoice. Let no word bring pain to his soul."
Running forward, the Prince clasped the French king by the 2 hands.
"Most welcome, sire," he cried. "Indeed, it is good for us that so gallant a knight should stay with us for some short time, since the chance of war has so ordered it. Bring wine there. Bring wine for the king."
But John was flushed and angry. His helmet had been roughly torn off, and blood was smeared upon his cheek. His noisy captors stood around him in a circle, eyeing him hungrily like dogs who have been beaten from their quarry. There were Gascons and English, knights and squires and archers, all pushing and straining.
"I pray you, fair Prince, to get rid of these rude fellows," said King John, "for indeed they have plagued me sorely. By Saint Denis, my arm has been well nigh pulled from its socket." "What wish you then?" asked the Prince, turning angrily upon the noisy swarm of his followers. "We took him, fair lord. He is ours," cried a score of voices. They closed in, all yelping together like a pack of wolves. "It was I, fair lord." "Nay, it was I." "You lie, you rascal. It was I." Again their fierce eyes glared, and their blood-stained hands sought the hilts of their weapons. "Nay, this must be settled here and now," said the Prince. "I crave your patience, fair and honored sir, for a few brief minutes, since indeed much ill will may spring from this if it not be set at rest. Who is this tall knight who can scarce keep his hands from the King's shoulder?" "It is Denis de Morbecque, my lord, a knight of St. Omer, who is in our service, being an outlaw from France." "I call him to mind. How then, Sir Denis? What say you in this matter?" "He gave himself to me, fair lord. He had fallen in the press, and I came upon him and seized him. I told him that I was a knight from Artois, and he gave me his glove. See, here I bear it in my hand." "It is true, fair lord, it is true," cried a dozen French voices. "Nay, sir, judge not too soon," shouted an English squire, pushing his way to the front. "It was I who had him at my mercy, and he is my prisoner, for he spoke to this man only because he could tell by his tongue that he was his own countryman. I took him, and here are a score to prove it." "It is true, fair lord. We saw it, and it was even so," cried a chorus of Englishmen. At all times there was growling and snapping betwixt the English and their allies of France. The Prince saw how easily this might set alight to such a flame as could not readily be quenched. It must be stamped out now ere it had time to mount. "Fair and honored lord," he said to the King, "again I pray you for a moment of patience. It is your word and only yours which can tell us what is just and right. To whom were you graciously pleased to commit your royal person?" The King looked up from the flagon which had been brought to him and wiped his lips with the dawnings of a smile upon his ruddy face. "It was not this Englishman," he said, and a cheer burst from the Gascons. "Nor was it this bastard Frenchman," he added. "To neither of them did I surrender." There was a hush of surprise. "To whom then, sir?" asked the Prince. The King looked slowly round. "There was a devil of a yellow horse," said he. "My poor palfrey went over like a skittle-pin before the ball. Of the rider I saw nothing save that he bore red roses on a silver shield. Ah, by Saint Denis, there is the man himself, and there his thrice accursed horse." His head swimming and moving as if in a dream, Nigel found himself the center of the circle of armed and angry men. The Prince laid his hand upon his shoulder. "It is the little cock of Tilford Bridge," said he. "On my father's soul, I have ever said that you would win your way. Did you receive the King's surrender?" "Nay, fair lord, I did not receive it." "Did you hear him give it?" "I heard, sir, but I did not know that it was the King. My master, Lord Chandos, had gone on, and I followed after." "And left him lying. Then the surrender was not complete, and by the laws of war the ransom goes to Denis de Morbecque, if his story be true." "It is true," said the King. "He was the second." "Then the ransom is yours, Denis. But for my part, I swear by my father's soul that I had rather have the honor this squire has gathered than all the richest ransoms of France." At these words, spoken before that circle of noble warriors, Nigel's heart gave one great throb, and he dropped upon his knee before the Prince. "Fair lord, how can I thank you?" he murmured. "These words at least are more than any ransom." "Rise up," said the smiling Prince, and he smote with his sword upon his shoulder. "England has lost a brave squire and gained a gallant knight. Nay, linger not, I pray. Rise up, Sir Nigel."
Chapter 27 of Sir Nigel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Clive Catterall. Sir Nigel by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Chapter 27. How the third messenger came to Cosford. 2 months have passed, and the long slopes of Hindhead are russet with the faded ferns, the fuzzy brown pelt which wraps the chilling earth. With whoop and scream the wild November wind sweeps over the great rolling downs, tossing the branches of the Cosford beeches and rattling at the rude latticed windows. The stout old knight of Duplin, grown even a little stouter, with whiter beard to fringe an ever redder face, sits as of yore at the head of his own board. A well-heaped platter, flanked by a foaming tankard, stands before him. At his right sits the Lady Mary, her dark, plain, queenly face marked deep with those years of weary waiting, but bearing the gentle grace and dignity which only sorrow and restraint can give. On his left is Matthew, the old priest. Long ago the golden-haired beauty had passed from Cosford to Fernhurst, where the young and beautiful Lady Edith Brocas is the belle of all Sussex, a sunbeam of smiles and merriment, save perhaps when her thoughts, for an instant, fly back to that dread night when she was plucked from under the very talons of the foul hawk of Shalford. The old knight looked up as a fresh gust of wind with a dash of rain beat against the window behind him.
"By St. Hubert, it is a wild night," said he. "I had hoped to-morrow to have a flight at a heron of the pool or a mallard at the brook. How fares it with little Catherine the peregrine, Mary?"
"I have joined the wing, father, and I have imped the feathers, but I fear it will be Christmas ere she can fly again."
"This is a hard saying," said Sir John, "for indeed I have seen no bolder or better bird. Her wing was broken by a heron's beak last Sabbath se'nnight, holy father, and Mary has the mending of it."
"I trust, my son, that you have heard mass ere you turned to worldly pleasure upon God's holy day," Father Matthew answered.
"Tut, tut," said the old knight, laughing. "Shall I make confession at the head of my own table? I can worship the good God amongst his own works, the woods and the fields, better than in yon pile of stone and wood. But I call to mind a charm for a wounded hawk, which was taught me by the fowler of Gaston de Foix. How did it run? The Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, has conquered. Yes, those are the words to be said 3 times as he walked round the perch where the bird is mewed."
The old priest shook his head. "Nay, these charms are the tricks of the devil," said he. "Holy Church leads them no countenance, for they are neither good nor fair. But how is it now with your tapestry, Lady Mary? When last I was beneath this roof, you had half done in 5 fair colors the story of Theseus and Ariadne."
"It is half done still, holy father."
"How is this, my daughter? Have you then so many calls?"
"Nay, holy father, her thoughts are otherwhere," Sir John answered. "She will sit an hour at a time, the needle in her hand, and her soul 100 leagues from Cosford House. Ever since the Prince's battle—"
"Good father, I beg you."
"Nay, Mary, none can hear me save your own confessor, Father Matthew. Ever since the Prince's battle, I say, when we heard that young Nigel had won such honor, she is brainwode, and sits ever, well, even as you see her now."
An intent look had come into Mary's eyes. Her gaze was fixed upon the dark, rain-splashed window. It was a face carved from ivory, white-lipped and rigid, on which the old priest looked.
"What is it, my daughter? What do you see?"
"I see nothing, father."
"What is it then that disturbs you?"
"I hear, father."
"What do you hear?"
"There are horsemen on the road."
The old knight laughed.
"So it goes on, father. What day is there that 100 horsemen do not pass our gate? And yet every clink of hoofs sets her poor heart a-trembling. So strong and steadfast she has ever been, my Mary, and now no sound too slight to shake her to the soul." "Nay, daughter, nay, I pray you."
She had half risen from her chair, her hands clenched and her dark, startled eyes still fixed upon the window.
"I hear them, father. I hear them amid the wind and the rain. Yes, yes, they are turning. They have turned. My God, they are at our very door."
"By St. Hubert, the girl is right," cried old Sir John,
beating his fist upon the board.
"Ho, varlets! Out with you to the yard. Set the mulled wine on the blaze once more. There are travellers at the gate, and it is no night to keep a dog waiting at our door. Hurry, Hannikin, hurry, I say, or I will haste you with my cudgel."
Plainly to the ears of all men could be heard the stamping of the horses. Mary had stood up, quivering in every limb. An eager step at the threshold. The door was flung wide, and there in the opening stood Nigel, the rain gleaming upon his smiling face, his cheeks flushed with the beating of the wind, his blue eyes shining with tenderness and love. Something held her by the throat. The light of the torches danced up and down. But her strong spirit rose at the thought that others should see that inner holy of holies of her soul. There is a heroism of women to which no valor of man can attain. Her eyes only carried him her message as she held out her hand. "Welcome, Nigel," said she. He stooped and kissed it. "St. Catherine has brought me home," said he. A merry supper it was at Cosford Manor that night, with Nigel at the head, betwixt the jovial old knight and the Lady Mary, whilst at the farther end Samkin Aylward, wedged between two servant maids, kept his neighbors in alternate laughter and terror as he told his tales of the French wars. Nigel had to turn his doeskin heels and show his little golden spurs. As he spoke of what was past, Sir John clapped him on the shoulder, while Mary took his strong right hand in hers, and the good old priest, smiling, blessed them both. Nigel had drawn a little golden ring from his pocket, and it twinkled in the torchlight. "Did you say that you must go on your way tomorrow, father?" he asked the priest. "Indeed, fair son, the matter presses. But you may bide the morning." "It will suffice if I start at noon."
"Much may be done in a morning."
He looked at Mary, who blushed and smiled.
"By St. Paul, I have waited long enough." "Good, good," chuckled the old knight with wheezy laughter. "Even so I wooed your mother, Mary. Wooers were brisk in the olden time. Tomorrow is Tuesday, and Tuesday is ever a lucky day. Alas, that the good Dame Ermyntrude is no longer with us to see it done. The old hound must run us down, Nigel, and I hear its bay upon my heels, but my heart will rejoice that before the end I may call you son. Give me your hand, Mary, and yours, Nigel. Now, take an old man's blessing. May God keep and guard you both, and give you your desert, for I believe, on my soul, that in all this broad land there dwells no nobler man, nor any woman more fitted to be his mate."
There let us leave them, their hearts full of gentle joy, the golden future of hope and promise stretching out before their youthful eyes. Alas for those green spring dreamings! How often do they fade and wither until they fall and rot, a dreary sight by the wayside of life. But here, by God's blessing, it was not so, for they burgeoned and they grew, ever fairer and more noble, until the whole wide world might marvel at the beauty of it. It has been told elsewhere how, as the years passed, Nigel's name rose higher in honor, but still Mary's would keep pace with it, each helping and sustaining the other upon an ever higher path. In many lands did Nigel carve his fame, and ever as he returned, spent and weary from his work, he drank fresh strength and fire and craving for honor from her who glorified his home. At Twynham Castle they dwelled for many years, beloved and honored by all. Then, in the fullness of time, they came back to the Tilford Manor House, and spent their happy, healthy age amid those heather downs where Nigel had passed his first lusty youth, ere ever he turned his face to the wars. Thither also came Aylward, when he had left the Pied Merlin, where for many a year he sold ale to the men of the forest. But the years pass, the old wheel turns, and ever the thread runs out. The wise and the good, the noble and the brave, they come from darkness, and into darkness they go, whence, whither, and why, who may say? Here is the slope of Hindhead. The fern still grows russet in November, the heather still burns red in July. But where now is the manor of Cosford? Where is the old house of Tilford? Where, but for a few scattered grey stones, is the mighty pile of Waverley? And yet even gnawing time has not eaten all things away.
Walk with me towards Guildford, reader, upon the busy highway. Here, where the high green mound rises before us, mark yonder roofless shrine, which still stands foursquare to the winds. It is St. Catherine's, where Nigel and Mary plighted their faith. Below lies the winding river, and over yonder you still see the dark Chantry woods, which mount up to the bare summit, on which, roofed and whole, stands that chapel of the Martyr, where the comrades beat off the archers of the crooked Lord of Shalford. Down yonder, on the flanks of the long chalk hills, one traces the road by which they made their journey to the wars. And now turn hither to the north, down this sunken winding path. It is all unchanged since Nigel's day. Here is the church of Compton. Pass under the aged and crumbling arch. Before the steps of that ancient altar, unrecorded and unbrassed, lies the dust of Nigel and of Mary. Near them is that of Maud, their daughter, and of Alan Edricson, whose spouse she was. Their children and children's children are lying by their side. Here, too, near the old yew in the churchyard, is the little mound which marks where Samkin Aylward went back into that good soil from which he sprang. So lie the dead leaves. But they, and such as they, nourish forever that great old trunk of England, which still sheds forth another crop and another, each as strong and as fair as the last. The body may lie in mouldering chancel or in crumbling vault, but the rumour of noble lives, the record of valour and truth, can never die, but lives on in the soul of the people. Our own work lies ready to our hands, and yet our strength may be the greater and our faith the firmer if we spare an hour from present toils to look back upon the women who were gentle and strong, or the men who loved honour more than life, on this green stage of England, where for a few short years we play our little part.